Victoria Chen was 52 years old when they told her she was no longer the right fit for the company's evolving image. The boardroom was filled with executives half her age, all nodding in agreement as the CEO explained that her replacement would bring, quote, fresh energy and innovative thinking to the chief marketing officer position she had built from nothing over 15 years. What they didn't know was that Victoria had spent the last 3 years preparing for this exact moment, quietly building intellectual property portfolios and strategic partnerships that would make their betrayal the most expensive mistake in corporate history. If you think age discrimination was the end of this story, you're wrong. What happened next didn't just destroy careers. It rewrote the rules of executive compensation and sent shockwaves through the entire pharmaceutical industry. Stay with me, because this isn't just about a woman who got even. It's about what happens when experience meets preparation and dignity demands justice. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The conference room on the 38th floor of Meridian Pharmaceuticals gleamed with polished mahogany and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered commanding views of downtown Seattle. The morning sun cast long shadows across the executive table where Victoria Chen had sat for countless board meetings, strategic planning sessions, and quarterly reviews that had consistently exceeded performance targets for over a decade. At exactly 9:30 on Tuesday morning, March 15th, Victoria received the text message that would change everything. Emergency board meeting. Conference room A, immediate attendance required. The message came from Jennifer Walsh, the recently hired Chief Human Resources Officer, who was young enough to be Victoria's daughter and possessed the kind of MBA credentials that impressed investors, while lacking the practical experience that actually drove business results. Victoria had been expecting this summons for months, though she had hoped her preparations would provide more time to execute her strategic plans. The signs had been accumulating like storm clouds on the horizon, younger executives being hired into senior positions, her access to certain board discussions becoming mysteriously limited, and the increasingly frequent comments about modernizing the leadership team that seemed to follow her presence in meetings. She straightened her charcoal business suit, the same designer ensemble she had worn to secure the Meridian account that had generated over $200 million in revenue during her tenure as chief marketing officer. Her reflection in the conference room's glass doors showed a woman who had maintained her professional appearance with the same meticulous attention she applied to every aspect of her career. Silver hair styled in a sophisticated bob, minimal but expertly applied makeup, and the confident posture of someone who had spent decades proving her capabilities in boardrooms dominated by men who initially questioned her presence. The assembled executives looked uncomfortably young in the morning light. Robert Harrison, the 38-year-old CEO who had been promoted from his previous role as Director of Digital Strategy, sat at the head of the table with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he was about to deliver news he found distasteful but necessary. To his left sat Jennifer Walsh, her tablet computer displaying what Victoria recognized as her personnel file and performance evaluations. The chief financial officer, David Kim, avoided eye contact while shuffling papers that undoubtedly contained financial justifications for decisions that had already been made. Victoria, thank you for joining us on short notice. Harrison began, his voice carrying the practiced tone of someone who had rehearsed this conversation multiple times. We need to discuss some significant changes to our executive structure. Changes that will position Meridian Pharmaceuticals for the next phase of growth and innovation. The language was corporate speak, carefully crafted to sound strategic and forward-thinking while obscuring the personal impact of what was about to unfold. Victoria had heard similar presentations during her early career, when other experienced executives were quietly pushed aside to make room for younger candidates who supposedly brought fresh perspectives and innovative approaches to established business practices. Our board of directors has been evaluating the leadership team's alignment with our evolving corporate vision. Jennifer Walsh continued, reading from prepared notes with the mechanical precision of someone delivering uncomfortable news to minimize personal engagement. We've identified opportunities to restructure key positions to better reflect our commitment to innovation and contemporary market approaches. Victoria remained silent, allowing them to continue their carefully orchestrated presentation. She understood that interrupting or challenging their narrative would only provide justification for their decision while demonstrating none of the grace and professionalism that had defined her career. Instead, she observed their body language, noting the nervous gestures and averted gazes that revealed their discomfort with the process they were implementing. Harrison leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped on the polished table surface. "Victoria, your contributions to Meridian Pharmaceuticals have been substantial and valued. However, we've decided to restructure the Chief Marketing Officer position to align with our digital transformation initiatives and contemporary branding strategies." The euphemisms continued to flow like carefully measured doses of anesthetic, designed to numb the impact of what was essentially a professional execution. Victoria had watched similar scenarios unfold throughout her career, observing how organizations discarded experienced professionals while using language that suggested strategic necessity rather than age-based discrimination. "We're promoting Madison Torres from her current role as Digital Marketing Director to assume the Chief Marketing Officer position," David Kim announced, finally making eye contact with Victoria. Her background in social media marketing and influencer partnerships represents the kind of innovative thinking our brand requires in today's competitive marketplace. Madison Torres was 29 years old, possessed an advanced degree in marketing communications, and had been with the company for exactly 18 months. Her previous experience consisted primarily of managing social media campaigns for consumer products companies, with no background in pharmaceutical marketing regulations, no experience with FDA compliance requirements, and no understanding of the complex relationship between medical professionals and pharmaceutical marketing strategies. Victoria had trained Madison personally during her initial months at Meridian, sharing insights about regulatory requirements, building relationships with medical professionals, and navigating the ethical considerations that distinguished pharmaceutical marketing from consumer goods promotion. Madison had been an eager student, frequently requesting additional guidance and expressing gratitude for Victoria's mentorship. "Madison will bring fresh energy and innovative thinking to the position," Jennifer Walsh added, consulting her notes. Her understanding of digital marketing trends and contemporary communication strategies will help Meridian connect with younger healthcare professionals and expand our market reach through modern channels. The irony was profound and painful. Victoria had been the executive who initiated Meridian's digital transformation, who had championed the integration of social media strategies with traditional pharmaceutical marketing approaches, and who had hired Madison specifically to develop the innovative programs that were now being used to justify her replacement. Harrison reached across the table and slid a manila envelope toward Victoria's position. "We've prepared a comprehensive separation package that reflects our appreciation for your service and our commitment to ensuring a smooth transition. The terms are generous and include extended healthcare benefits, consulting opportunities, and non-compete considerations that protect both your interests and the company's intellectual property." The non-compete clause represented the crux of their miscalculation, though they could not yet comprehend the magnitude of their error. Victoria had spent considerable time reviewing the legal documents that governed her employment relationship with Meridian, paying particular attention to the intellectual property provisions and competitive restrictions that would apply following her departure from the company. "You'll have 30 days to review the separation agreement with legal counsel," Jennifer Walsh explained, her voice carrying a tone that suggested this was merely a formality. "We're confident that the terms will meet your expectations and provide a foundation for your future endeavors." Victoria opened the envelope and scanned the key provisions of the separation agreement. The financial terms were indeed generous: 2 years of salary continuation, extended health insurance coverage, and access to executive placement services that would assist with identifying new opportunities. However, the non-compete restrictions were comprehensive and restrictive, preventing her from working for any pharmaceutical company or providing consulting services to Meridian's competitors for a period of 5 years following her departure. The 5-year non-compete period was unusually lengthy for the pharmaceutical industry, where standard agreements typically ranged from 12 to 24 months. However, Victoria had negotiated these terms herself during her initial contract discussions 15 years earlier, specifically requesting extended non-compete protection in exchange for expanded intellectual property rights and increased compensation for proprietary methodologies she would develop during her tenure. The non-compete provisions ensure that our proprietary marketing strategies and client relationships remain protected, David Kim explained, apparently unaware that Victoria had designed most of those proprietary strategies herself and maintained personal relationships with clients that predated her employment with Meridian. Victoria closed the envelope and placed it carefully in her briefcase. I appreciate the thoroughness of the separation package. However, I'll need to review the intellectual property provisions with my legal counsel before providing a response. The mention of intellectual property created a momentary pause in the conversation. Harrison exchanged glances with Jennifer Walsh, both apparently uncertain about the implications of Victoria's comment. They had prepared for emotional responses, potential challenges to the decision, or requests for reconsideration, but they had not anticipated technical discussions about intellectual property rights. "Of course," Harrison replied after a moment, "we want to ensure that all parties understand their rights and obligations under the agreement. Jennifer can provide contact information for external counsel if you don't currently have representation for employment matters. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us." Now back to the story. Victoria smiled slightly, the first expression of genuine emotion she had displayed during the meeting. "Thank you for the offer, but I have existing counsel for intellectual property matters. They've been reviewing various aspects of my professional arrangements for several months in preparation for potential transitions." This statement created visible confusion around the table. The executives had expected Victoria to be surprised and unprepared for the separation discussion. Not strategically positioned with legal counsel already engaged in reviewing her professional arrangements. The implication that she had been anticipating changes to her employment status suggested a level of preparation that they had not considered. Jennifer Walsh consulted her tablet computer, apparently searching for additional talking points or procedural requirements. "We'll need to coordinate the transition of your current projects and client relationships to Madison and other team members. Your cooperation in ensuring continuity will be appreciated and will facilitate the processing of your separation benefits." The transition coordination represented another area where Victoria's preparations would soon become apparent. Over the past 3 years, she had been methodically documenting her proprietary methodologies, securing intellectual property protections for innovative marketing approaches she had developed, and establishing independent relationships with key clients and industry partners that existed separately from her Meridian employment. "I'll provide comprehensive documentation for all current projects and client relationships," Victoria replied. "However, I should mention that several of my proprietary methodologies are protected by patents and copyrights that I hold independently. The transition team will need to consider these intellectual property rights when determining how to proceed with certain strategic initiatives." The room fell silent as the implications of Victoria's statement began to register. Harrison leaned back in his chair, his confident demeanor replaced by uncertainty and concern. The separation they had envisioned, as a straightforward personnel change, was becoming more complex than they had anticipated. David Kim was the first to speak, his voice reflecting new awareness of potential complications. "Victoria, can you clarify which methodologies and strategies might be affected by independent intellectual property rights?" Victoria opened her briefcase and withdrew a leather portfolio containing documents she had hoped to never need, but had prepared with meticulous care. "The integrated digital marketing framework that generated 43% of our new client acquisitions over the past 2 years is protected by patents I filed independently. The pharmaceutical compliance protocol system that has prevented regulatory violations across our entire portfolio is copyrighted under my name. The predictive analytics model that increased campaign effectiveness by 67% is proprietary technology that I developed using personal resources and time." Each item she mentioned represented millions of dollars in revenue generation and cost avoidance for Meridian Pharmaceuticals. The executives were beginning to understand that replacing Victoria would require more than simply promoting Madison Torres to a new title. They would need to recreate the foundational systems and methodologies that had driven their marketing success for years. Jennifer Walsh attempted to regain control of the conversation. "Victoria, we appreciate your disclosure of these intellectual property considerations. However, we're confident that our legal team can work with your counsel to address any ownership questions and ensure appropriate transitions." Victoria closed the portfolio and returned it to her briefcase. I'm certain that our respective legal teams will have extensive discussions about these matters. However, I should mention that triggering my non-compete clause will activate certain provisions that might impact your transition planning. Harrison sat forward again, his expression now reflecting genuine concern. What do you mean by activating provisions? Victoria stood gracefully, smoothing her skirt and gathering her belongings with unhurried precision. Robert, when I negotiated my employment agreement 15 years ago, I insisted on non-compete protection that would compensate me for the intellectual property restrictions I would accept. The 5-year non-compete clause includes financial consideration equal to $8 million, payable upon activation of the competitive restrictions. The silence that followed was profound and absolute. 5 sets of eyes stared at Victoria, with expressions ranging from disbelief to horror. The generous separation package they had prepared suddenly appeared insignificant compared to the financial obligation they were about to trigger through their decision to terminate her employment. David Kim was the first to find his voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. $8 million? Victoria nodded once, her expression calm and professional. The non-compete compensation was structured as intellectual property licensing fees, recognizing that preventing me from working in the pharmaceutical industry would effectively transfer the exclusive use of my proprietary methodologies to Meridian. The arrangement seemed mutually beneficial at the time. Jennifer Walsh frantically scrolled through Victoria's employment file on her tablet, searching for documentation that none of them had apparently bothered to review carefully before orchestrating this meeting. The legal implications were becoming clear, and their carefully planned personnel change was transforming into a potential financial catastrophe. Harrison stood as well, his composure completely shattered. Victoria, perhaps we should postpone this discussion to allow for more comprehensive review of all relevant agreements and arrangements. Victoria smiled with genuine warmth for the first time during the meeting. Robert, I appreciate the suggestion, but I think the review process should have occurred before you decided to replace me with a younger model. I'll have my legal counsel contact your team to discuss the logistics of processing my non-compete compensation and managing the intellectual property transitions. As she moved toward the conference room door, Victoria paused and turned back to address the assembled executives one final time. I want to thank you all for this opportunity to clarify my professional situation. For months I've been uncertain about my future with Meridian, but your decision today has provided the clarity I needed to move forward with confidence. The door closed behind her with a soft click that somehow sounded like the opening movement of a symphony that would soon reach crescendo proportions throughout the pharmaceutical industry. Victoria Chen walked down the corridor toward the elevator, her steps measured and purposeful, carrying herself with the dignity of someone who had just transformed professional dismissal into personal empowerment. Behind her, in conference room A, 5 executives sat in stunned silence, beginning to comprehend that their attempt to discard an experienced professional had instead awakened a force that would soon demonstrate the true cost of underestimating expertise, preparation, and the quiet strength of someone who refuses to be diminished by others' limited vision of her worth. The real story was just beginning. Victoria Chen had not arrived at Meridian Pharmaceuticals 15 years earlier, with the intention of becoming the most strategically prepared executive in the pharmaceutical industry. She had simply been a 37-year-old marketing professional seeking stability and growth opportunities in a sector that valued both innovation and regulatory compliance. The seeds of her eventual triumph were planted not through grand design, but through the accumulated wisdom of a woman who had learned to anticipate challenges before they materialized. The pharmaceutical industry in 2008 was undergoing seismic shifts that most marketing professionals failed to fully comprehend. Digital transformation was beginning to disrupt traditional physician outreach methods. Regulatory requirements were becoming increasingly complex, and younger competitors were entering the field with technical skills but limited understanding of the intricate relationships between medical professionals, regulatory bodies, and pharmaceutical companies. Victoria recognized these trends early and made a strategic decision that would define her entire tenure at Meridian. Instead of viewing her role as simply executing marketing campaigns, she began treating her position as an opportunity to develop proprietary intellectual property that would transcend any single employment relationship. This approach required sacrificing immediate recognition and short-term advancement opportunities in favor of building long-term strategic assets that could provide security and leverage throughout her career. Her first major innovation emerged from a seemingly routine challenge. Meridian was struggling to maintain compliance with FDA regulations, while simultaneously developing marketing materials that effectively communicated complex medical information to healthcare professionals. The traditional approach involves sequential review processes where marketing content was created, then modified repeatedly to achieve regulatory compliance, resulting in delays that often rendered campaigns ineffective due to timing issues. Victoria spent 18 months developing what she privately called the Integrated Compliance Framework, a systematic approach that embedded regulatory requirements into the initial creative process, rather than treating compliance as a secondary consideration. The methodology required deep understanding of both marketing psychology and pharmaceutical regulations, combining creative development with legal compliance in ways that accelerated campaign development while reducing regulatory risk. The framework saved Meridian approximately $2 million in the first year, through reduced revision cycles and faster campaign deployment. However, Victoria made a crucial strategic decision that her colleagues did not understand at the time. Rather than seeking internal recognition for the innovation, she quietly filed patent applications for the core methodologies, funding the legal expenses through personal savings and presenting the patents as protective measures that would benefit Meridian through exclusive usage rights. Robert Harrison, then serving as Director of Digital Strategy, had been one of the few executives who recognized the significance of Victoria's approach. During their early working relationship, he frequently sought her guidance on integrating digital marketing strategies with traditional pharmaceutical promotion methods. Victoria shared her knowledge generously, helping Harrison develop the expertise that would eventually qualify him for executive advancement. Victoria, your understanding of regulatory compliance gives our digital initiatives credibility that our competitors lack, Harrison had told her during a strategic planning session in 2012. You have built systems that make complex challenges look effortless. Those words proved prophetic in ways that neither of them anticipated at the time. Victoria's ability to make complex challenges appear effortless was not accidental, but resulted from systematic preparation and continuous learning that extended far beyond her official responsibilities. She had developed the habit of studying industry trends, regulatory changes, and competitive strategies during evening hours and weekends, treating professional development as a personal investment rather than a corporate obligation. Her second major innovation addressed the growing importance of data analytics in pharmaceutical marketing. Traditional marketing approaches relied heavily on demographic segmentation and historical performance data, but Victoria recognized that predictive analytics could revolutionize campaign targeting and resource allocation. However, developing sophisticated analytics capabilities required technical expertise that most marketing professionals lacked. Victoria enrolled in graduate-level statistics courses at the University of Washington, funding her education through personal resources and completing coursework during evenings and weekends. The program required 3 years of part-time study, during which she maintained her full-time responsibilities at Meridian, while mastering advanced mathematical concepts that most marketing executives never encountered. The investment proved transformative. Victoria developed proprietary algorithms that could predict physician prescribing patterns based on demographic data, historical interactions, and market dynamics. The predictive models increased campaign effectiveness by 67%, while reducing marketing expenses through precise targeting that eliminated wasteful broad-spectrum approaches. Again, Victoria chose to patent her innovations independently, rather than assigning intellectual property rights to Meridian. She structured the arrangement as licensing agreements that provided Meridian with exclusive usage rights while maintaining her ownership of the underlying technologies. This approach required careful legal planning and significant upfront investment, but created intellectual property assets that would eventually prove invaluable. Jennifer Walsh, who joined Meridian as Chief Human Resources Officer in 2019, never understood the complexity of Victoria's strategic arrangements. During their initial interactions, Walsh had expressed surprise at Victoria's involvement in technical and legal matters that seemed peripheral to traditional marketing responsibilities. Victoria, your role has expanded considerably beyond typical marketing functions, Walsh had observed during a performance review meeting. Perhaps we should consider restructuring your responsibilities to focus on core marketing activities. Victoria had smiled diplomatically while internally recognizing that Walsh's comment revealed fundamental misunderstanding of how strategic intellectual property development functioned in modern pharmaceutical companies. The peripheral activities that Walsh questioned were actually the most valuable aspects of Victoria's contributions, generating competitive advantages that competitors could not easily replicate. The third area where Victoria developed proprietary expertise involved international market expansion. Meridian had historically focused on domestic pharmaceutical markets, but Victoria recognized that global expansion would become essential for sustained growth. However, international pharmaceutical marketing required understanding regulatory frameworks, cultural considerations, and competitive dynamics that varied dramatically across different countries. Victoria spent 2 years developing comprehensive market entry strategies for pharmaceutical companies seeking international expansion. She studied regulatory requirements in 12 different countries, established relationships with international consulting firms and legal experts, and created standardized methodologies that could accelerate market entry while minimizing regulatory and cultural risks. The international expansion framework proved exceptionally valuable when Meridian decided to enter European markets in 2018. Victoria's preparation enabled the company to achieve regulatory approval and market entry in 6 European countries within 18 months, a timeline that typically required 3 to 4 years for companies lacking specialized expertise. David Kim, who served as chief financial officer during the international expansion, had been impressed by Victoria's strategic preparation and attention to detail. Victoria, your international framework saved us approximately $12 million in consulting fees and lost time. You have developed institutional knowledge that would be extremely difficult to replace. Kim's assessment was accurate but incomplete. Victoria had not simply developed institutional knowledge, but had created proprietary intellectual property that existed independently of her employment relationship with Meridian. The international expansion methodologies were protected by copyrights and patents that Victoria owned personally, providing her with strategic leverage that her colleagues did not fully comprehend. Her fourth major area of innovation focused on crisis management and reputation protection. The pharmaceutical industry faced increasing scrutiny from regulatory bodies, media organizations, and consumer advocacy groups. Traditional public relations approaches were inadequate for managing complex crises that involved regulatory violations, product safety concerns, or adverse publicity that could destroy brand value and corporate reputation. Victoria developed comprehensive crisis management protocols that integrated legal compliance, public relations, regulatory affairs, and strategic communications in coordinated responses that minimize damage while preserving stakeholder relationships. The protocols required deep understanding of pharmaceutical regulations, media relations, legal requirements, and strategic communications that few professionals possessed across all disciplines simultaneously. The crisis management framework proved its value during a product recall situation in 2020 that could have resulted in regulatory sanctions and significant financial penalties for Meridian. Victoria's coordinated response strategy enabled the company to manage the recall process while maintaining positive relationships with regulatory bodies and minimizing negative publicity. The successful crisis resolution saved Meridian an estimated $25 million in potential penalties and lost revenue. Throughout these innovations, Victoria maintained meticulous documentation of her proprietary methodologies, patent filings, and intellectual property rights. She worked with specialized attorneys who focused on pharmaceutical intellectual property, ensuring that her innovations were properly protected and that her ownership rights were clearly established through legal documentation that would withstand scrutiny from corporate legal teams. Madison Torres, who joined Meridian as Digital Marketing Director in 2021, represented a new generation of marketing professionals who possessed strong technical skills but limited understanding of pharmaceutical industry complexities. Victoria had mentored Madison extensively, sharing insights about regulatory requirements, relationship building with medical professionals, and the strategic considerations that distinguished pharmaceutical marketing from consumer goods promotion. Madison, Pharmaceutical marketing requires understanding regulatory frameworks that can make or break entire campaigns, Victoria had explained during one of their mentoring sessions. Technical skills are important, but regulatory compliance and relationship management determine long-term success in this industry. Madison had been an enthusiastic student, frequently requesting additional guidance and expressing appreciation for Victoria's willingness to share knowledge that typically required years of experience to develop. However, Madison's rapid promotion to Chief Marketing Officer revealed that Meridian's leadership valued technical skills and contemporary credentials more than the deep industry expertise that Victoria had spent decades developing. The decision to replace Victoria with Madison represented a fundamental misunderstanding of the intellectual property landscape that Victoria had carefully constructed over 15 years. The proprietary methodologies, patent portfolios, and strategic frameworks that had driven Meridian's marketing success were not corporate assets that could be transferred to new personnel through organizational restructuring. They were personal intellectual property that Victoria owned independently and could withdraw from Meridian's usage upon termination of her employment relationship. Victoria's preparation for potential employment termination had begun 3 years earlier, when she first noticed subtle signs of age discrimination in corporate decision-making processes. Younger executives were being hired into senior positions, experienced professionals were being encouraged to consider early retirement, and strategic discussions increasingly emphasized the importance of fresh thinking and contemporary perspectives, in ways that seemed to discount the value of institutional knowledge and proven expertise. Rather than confronting these trends directly or seeking alternative employment opportunities, Victoria had chosen a more strategic approach. She began systematically documenting her intellectual property rights, strengthening her patent portfolios, and establishing independent relationships with clients and industry partners that existed separately from her Meridian employment. The non-compete clause that would soon devastate Meridian's financial position had been Victoria's most prescient strategic decision. 15 years earlier, when negotiating her initial employment agreement, Victoria had insisted on intellectual property protections that most executives never considered. She had specifically requested that any non-compete restrictions be accompanied by financial compensation that reflected the value of the intellectual property she would be prevented from utilizing elsewhere. The $8 million non-compete compensation had seemed reasonable to Meridian's leadership at the time because they viewed Victoria as a traditional marketing executive whose primary value lay in campaign execution and client relationship management. They had not anticipated that she would develop proprietary technologies and methodologies that would become fundamental to their competitive advantages. Victoria's strategic preparation represented more than professional planning. It embodied a philosophy of personal empowerment that recognized the importance of building independent capabilities rather than relying solely on corporate employment for security and advancement. Her approach required sacrificing immediate recognition and career advancement opportunities in favor of developing long-term strategic assets that could provide leverage and independence throughout her professional life. As Victoria walked out of Conference Room A on that March morning, carrying documentation that would soon transform her termination into the most expensive personnel decision in Meridian's corporate history, she reflected on the 15 years of systematic preparation that had made this moment possible. Her colleagues had viewed her as a marketing executive who happened to possess unusual technical expertise. In reality, she was a strategic intellectual property developer who had chosen to build her portfolio within the pharmaceutical industry. The foundation of her eventual triumph had been constructed through countless hours of study, research, patent applications, and legal planning that occurred beyond the visibility of colleagues who focused on immediate results rather than long-term strategic positioning. Victoria had understood that true professional security required more than excellent performance within assigned roles. It demanded the development of independent capabilities and intellectual property rights that could provide leverage when corporate loyalty proved insufficient protection against discriminatory decision-making. The real story was just beginning to unfold. The basement office of Victoria Chen's Queen Anne home bore no resemblance to a typical residential space. 3 years of systematic transformation had converted the modest 200-square-foot room into a sophisticated intellectual property development laboratory that rivaled the research facilities of major consulting firms. patent applications lined filing cabinets along one wall, while multiple computer workstations displayed real-time pharmaceutical market data, regulatory updates, and competitive intelligence feeds from across the global industry. Victoria had established this workspace in 2020, when she first recognized that her position at Meridian Pharmaceuticals might become vulnerable to age-based discrimination. Rather than accepting potential career disruption as inevitable, she had made a strategic decision to accelerate the development of independent intellectual property assets that could provide financial security and professional leverage regardless of her employment status. The transformation required significant personal investment. Victoria had allocated 30% of her annual salary to technology infrastructure, legal expenses, and professional development activities that occurred entirely outside her official responsibilities at Meridian. Her husband, David, a software engineer at Microsoft, initially questioned the substantial expenses associated with patent filings, specialized legal counsel, and advanced technical equipment that seemed excessive for someone employed full-time in pharmaceutical marketing. "Victoria, you are essentially operating a second career from our basement," David had observed during one of their discussions about the mounting expenses. "Are you planning to leave Meridian and start your own consulting company?" Victoria had considered this question carefully before responding. Her activities extended far beyond typical consulting preparation and represented something more ambitious than traditional entrepreneurial planning. She was constructing an intellectual property fortress that could protect her professional interests while providing strategic options that most executives never developed. "David, I am preparing for possibilities that may not materialize but could prove essential if they do," she had explained. "The pharmaceutical industry is changing rapidly, and traditional employment relationships may not provide the security they once offered for experienced professionals." Her prescience proved accurate in ways that exceeded even her strategic planning. The intellectual property empire she constructed during those 3 years would soon demonstrate its value through circumstances that validated her investment in independent capabilities and strategic preparation. Victoria's approach to intellectual property development reflected sophisticated understanding of how innovation creates lasting competitive advantages. Rather than focusing on single patents or isolated methodologies, she had developed integrated systems that addressed multiple aspects of pharmaceutical marketing through interconnected technologies that reinforced each other and created barriers to competitive replication. Her regulatory compliance framework represented the foundation of her intellectual property portfolio. Traditional pharmaceutical marketing required navigating complex FDA regulations, state-level compliance requirements, and international regulatory frameworks that varied significantly across different markets. Most marketing professionals treated regulatory compliance as a constraint that limited creative options and required expensive legal review processes. Victoria recognized that regulatory expertise could become a competitive advantage if properly systematized and protected through intellectual property rights. She spent 18 months developing algorithms that could automatically evaluate marketing content for regulatory compliance across multiple jurisdictions simultaneously. The system reduced compliance review time from weeks to hours while eliminating the risk of regulatory violations that could result in substantial penalties and market access restrictions. The regulatory compliance technology required integrating legal databases, regulatory monitoring systems, and content analysis algorithms in ways that demanded expertise across multiple disciplines simultaneously. Victoria had studied regulatory law, machine learning algorithms, and international pharmaceutical regulations through advanced coursework that she completed during evenings and weekends while maintaining her full-time responsibilities at Meridian. Her second major intellectual property development focused on predictive analytics for physician prescribing patterns. Traditional pharmaceutical marketing relied heavily on historical data and demographic segmentation that provided limited insight into future prescribing behavior. Victoria had recognized that predictive modeling could revolutionize campaign targeting and resource allocation through more sophisticated understanding of physician decision-making processes. The predictive analytics system required developing mathematical models that could process multiple data streams simultaneously, including physician education backgrounds, patient demographics, regional market dynamics, and competitive activity patterns. Victoria had collaborated with statisticians from the University of Washington and data scientists from Amazon to develop algorithms that exceeded the capabilities of existing pharmaceutical marketing technologies. The collaboration agreements she negotiated with academic and industry partners demonstrated her strategic understanding of intellectual property protection. Rather than employing consultants who might claim ownership rights to innovations developed during their engagement, Victoria structured partnerships that preserved her exclusive ownership of all technologies, while providing collaborators with licensing fees and professional recognition for their contributions. Her third area of intellectual property development addressed international market expansion strategies for pharmaceutical companies. Most American pharmaceutical companies struggled with international expansion due to regulatory complexity, cultural considerations, and competitive dynamics that varied dramatically across different countries. Victoria had identified this challenge as an opportunity to develop proprietary methodologies that could accelerate international market entry while minimizing risk and regulatory complications. The international expansion framework required understanding regulatory requirements, market dynamics, and competitive landscapes across 12 different countries. Victoria had established relationships with regulatory experts, legal counsel, and market research firms in each target country, creating an intelligence network that provided real-time insights into market opportunities and regulatory changes. She had systematically documented market entry strategies for major pharmaceutical markets, including Germany, France, the United Kingdom, Japan, Brazil, and Australia. Each market required customized approaches that reflected local regulatory requirements, competitive dynamics, and cultural considerations that could determine the success or failure of market entry initiatives. The documentation process revealed another dimension of Victoria's strategic thinking. Rather than simply developing internal knowledge that could be transferred to colleagues or competitors, she had created formal intellectual property assets that were protected through patents, copyrights, and trade secret designations that established her exclusive ownership of the methodologies. Her fourth major intellectual property development focused on crisis management and reputation protection for pharmaceutical companies. The pharmaceutical industry faced increasing scrutiny from regulatory bodies, media organizations, and consumer advocacy groups that could rapidly damage brand reputation and corporate value through negative publicity or regulatory investigations. Victoria had studied major pharmaceutical crises over the past decade, analyzing how different companies had responded to product recalls, regulatory violations, adverse publicity, and competitive attacks. Her analysis revealed that most pharmaceutical companies lacked systematic approaches to crisis management and relied on reactive strategies that often amplified problems rather than containing them. She developed comprehensive crisis management protocols that integrated legal compliance, public relations, regulatory affairs, and strategic communications in coordinated responses that minimized damage while preserving stakeholder relationships. The protocols included specific procedures for different types of crises, communication templates that could be customized rapidly, and decision-making frameworks that enabled rapid response without compromising regulatory compliance or legal protection. The crisis management framework proved its value when Victoria applied it to manage a product recall situation for Meridian in 2020. Her coordinated response strategy enabled the company to manage the recall process while maintaining positive relationships with regulatory bodies and minimizing negative publicity. The successful crisis resolution demonstrated the practical value of her intellectual property, while providing concrete evidence of her strategic capabilities. Victoria's intellectual property development activities required sophisticated legal planning that extended far beyond typical patent applications. She had retained specialized attorneys who focused exclusively on pharmaceutical intellectual property, ensuring that her innovations were properly protected through multiple overlapping legal mechanisms that would withstand challenges from corporate legal teams. The legal strategy included utility patents for technological innovations, method patents for procedural approaches, copyrights for documentation and training materials, and trade secret protections for confidential information that provided competitive advantages. Each intellectual property asset was supported by comprehensive documentation that established priority dates, development processes, and ownership rights that could be defended through litigation if necessary. Her patent portfolio alone included 47 separate applications covering different aspects of pharmaceutical marketing, regulatory compliance, predictive analytics, and crisis management. The patents represented millions of dollars in potential licensing revenue and established legal barriers that would prevent competitors from replicating her innovations without negotiating licensing agreements. The copyright protections covered training materials, documentation systems, and procedural manuals that Victoria had developed to support implementation of her proprietary methodologies. The copyrighted materials could be licensed independently or used to support consulting services that generated additional revenue streams beyond patent licensing fees. Trade secret protections covered confidential information including client lists, competitive intelligence, regulatory contacts, and strategic relationships that Victoria had developed over 15 years in the pharmaceutical industry. The trade secrets represented perhaps the most valuable component of her intellectual property portfolio, because they could not be replicated through independent development and required direct access to Victoria's knowledge and relationships. Victoria's intellectual property empire included strategic partnerships with technology companies, consulting firms, and academic institutions that expanded her capabilities while preserving her ownership of core innovations. She had negotiated licensing agreements with software developers who integrated her algorithms into their products, generating royalty payments that provided ongoing revenue streams independent of her employment at Meridian. The partnership agreements demonstrated another dimension of her strategic thinking. Rather than attempting to develop all capabilities independently, Victoria had identified complementary organizations that could enhance her technologies while preserving her intellectual property rights through carefully structured legal arrangements. Her relationship with Chen Analytics, a boutique consulting firm specializing in pharmaceutical market research, provided access to proprietary databases and analytical capabilities that enhanced her predictive modeling algorithms. The partnership agreement granted Chen Analytics licensing rights to use Victoria's methodologies in their client engagements, while providing Victoria with enhanced data access and analytical support. Similarly, her collaboration with Regulatory Solutions International provided access to regulatory expertise across multiple international markets, while expanding the global applicability of her compliance frameworks. The partnership enabled Victoria to offer comprehensive international regulatory support through her intellectual property licensing arrangements. The financial structure of Victoria's intellectual property empire reflected sophisticated understanding of how to monetize innovation through multiple revenue streams that provided stability and growth potential. Patent licensing fees provided immediate revenue, while royalty payments from ongoing usage created recurring income that grew with market adoption of her technologies. Consulting services based on her proprietary methodologies generated premium fees because clients gained access to proven systems rather than experimental approaches. Training and certification programs for her methodologies created additional revenue streams while establishing industry standards that reinforced her competitive position. Victoria had structured her intellectual property holdings through a Delaware limited liability company that provided tax advantages, liability protection, and operational flexibility for managing her growing portfolio of innovations. The corporate structure enabled her to separate her intellectual property assets from personal liability, while providing professional credibility that supported her consulting and licensing activities. The business entity also facilitated strategic planning for potential expansion of her intellectual property development activities. Victoria had developed 5-year projections that anticipated growing demand for her regulatory compliance, predictive analytics, and international expansion methodologies, as the pharmaceutical industry continued evolving toward more sophisticated marketing approaches. Her projections indicated that her intellectual property portfolio could generate annual revenues exceeding $2 million within 5 years through combinations of licensing fees, consulting services, and strategic partnerships. The projected revenue levels would exceed her current salary at Meridian while providing greater professional autonomy and strategic flexibility. However, the most significant value of Victoria's intellectual property empire lay not in immediate revenue generation but in strategic leverage that could protect her professional interests when corporate loyalty proved insufficient. The non-compete clause that would soon devastate Meridian's financial position represented only one dimension of the strategic options that her intellectual property portfolio provided. Victoria had also developed contingency plans for competitive responses that could potentially challenge her intellectual property rights or attempt to circumvent her legal protections. Her legal counsel had prepared defensive strategies that included patent infringement litigation, trade secret misappropriation claims, and regulatory compliance violations that could be pursued against organizations that attempted to replicate her innovations without authorization. The defensive legal strategies represented another form of protection that extended beyond traditional intellectual property rights. Victoria's deep understanding of pharmaceutical regulations and compliance requirements enabled her to identify potential violations by competitors who might attempt to implement similar systems without proper legal authorization or regulatory approval. As Victoria prepared for the confrontation that would soon transform her termination from Meridian into the most expensive personnel decision in the company's history, she reflected on the 3 years of systematic preparation that had created this unprecedented situation. Her colleagues had viewed her as an experienced marketing executive who possessed unusual technical expertise. The reality was far more complex and strategically significant. Victoria Chen had constructed an intellectual property empire that demonstrated how individual professionals could build independent strategic assets that transcended traditional employment relationships. Her approach required significant personal investment, sophisticated legal planning, and systematic execution over multiple years, but created options and protections that would soon prove invaluable when corporate discrimination threatened her professional security. The foundation of her eventual triumph had been constructed through countless hours of research, development, and legal planning that occurred entirely beyond the awareness of colleagues who focused on immediate results rather than long-term strategic positioning. Victoria had understood that true professional security required building independent capabilities that could provide leverage when traditional employment relationships proved inadequate protection against discriminatory decision-making. The executive conference room at Meridian Pharmaceuticals buzzed with the controlled energy of a quarterly strategic planning session. Victoria Chen sat at her customary position along the polished mahogany table, reviewing performance metrics that demonstrated another quarter of exceptional results for the marketing division. Her pharmaceutical compliance framework had prevented 3 potential regulatory violations that could have cost the company millions in penalties. Her predictive analytics models had increased campaign effectiveness by 42% compared to the previous year. Her crisis management protocols had successfully contained 2 product liability issues before they escalated into major public relations disasters. Yet Victoria understood that her colleagues perceived these achievements as the natural output of an experienced marketing executive, rather than the result of proprietary intellectual property systems that she had developed independently. The cognitive dissonance of this situation had become increasingly pronounced as her secret intellectual property empire began generating recognition and revenue streams that existed entirely outside Meridian's organizational awareness. Robert Harrison, now serving as Chief Executive Officer, opened the meeting with his characteristic enthusiasm for digital transformation initiatives. His presentation emphasized the importance of contemporary marketing approaches that could connect with younger healthcare professionals and leverage emerging social media platforms for pharmaceutical promotion. The irony was profound given that Victoria had pioneered most of these digital marketing strategies during her tenure as Chief Marketing Officer, though her contributions were now being reframed as innovative thinking from newer team members. Our market research indicates that younger physicians increasingly rely on digital information sources for clinical decision-making, Harrison explained, displaying charts that reflected conclusions Victoria had reached and documented 3 years earlier. We need marketing strategies that speak their language and meet them where they consume information. Madison Torres, sitting across the table from Victoria, nodded enthusiastically while taking notes on approaches that Victoria had originally developed and shared during their mentoring sessions. Madison's rapid promotion to digital marketing director had been justified through her supposed expertise in contemporary marketing trends, though her actual knowledge derived primarily from training and guidance that Victoria had provided over the past 18 months. The meeting proceeded through predictable discussions of budget allocations, campaign priorities, and competitive responses that reflected strategic frameworks Victoria had created but rarely received credit for developing. She participated in these conversations with professional engagement while simultaneously managing multiple consulting projects through her independent intellectual property business that operated entirely beyond Meridian's knowledge or involvement. That afternoon, while her Meridian colleagues assumed she was developing traditional marketing campaigns, Victoria was actually conducting a confidential strategy session with executives from Novus Therapeutics, a mid-sized pharmaceutical company that had licensed her regulatory compliance framework for their European market expansion. The consulting engagement represented her most significant independent project to date, involving comprehensive market entry strategies for 5 European countries and generating fees that exceeded her quarterly salary from Meridian. Dr. Michael Rodriguez, Chief Executive Officer of Novus Therapeutics, had initially approached Victoria through professional networks after learning about her regulatory expertise through industry publications. The initial conversation had revealed that Novus faced exactly the type of complex regulatory challenges that Victoria's intellectual property systems were designed to address. "Victoria, your regulatory compliance framework is precisely what we need for European market entry," Rodriguez had explained during their first consultation meeting. "Our internal team lacks the specialized knowledge required to navigate the regulatory complexity across multiple European markets simultaneously." The Novus engagement required Victoria to operate with extraordinary discretion given her employment obligations to Meridian. She had structured the consulting arrangement through her Delaware limited liability company, ensuring that all communications and deliverables were handled through her independent business entity rather than her personal identity as a Meridian employee. The project involved developing customized regulatory compliance procedures for Germany, France, the United Kingdom, Netherlands, and Belgium. Each market required understanding specific regulatory frameworks, documentation requirements, and approval processes that could determine the success or failure of pharmaceutical product launches. Victoria's proprietary systems enabled Novus to accelerate their European expansion timeline by 18 months, while reducing regulatory risk through comprehensive compliance procedures. The financial terms of the Novus engagement reflected the premium value that specialized regulatory expertise commanded in the pharmaceutical industry. Victoria's consulting fees totaled $425,000 for the 6-month project, with additional royalty payments based on successful market entry milestones. The revenue represented more than her annual salary from Meridian and demonstrated the substantial economic value of the intellectual property she had developed independently. However, the most significant aspect of the Novus engagement was not financial compensation, but professional validation. Victoria's intellectual property systems were proving their effectiveness in competitive pharmaceutical markets, generating measurable results that exceeded traditional consulting approaches. The success created referral opportunities with other pharmaceutical companies that sought similar regulatory expertise for their international expansion initiatives. Victoria's second major consulting project during this period involved developing crisis management protocols for Biopharma Solutions, a biotechnology company facing potential regulatory sanctions related to clinical trial irregularities. The situation required sophisticated understanding of FDA regulatory processes, legal compliance requirements, and strategic communications that could minimize damage while preserving the company's ability to continue product development activities. Dr. Sarah Kim, Chief Regulatory Officer at Biopharma Solutions, had contacted Victoria after learning about her crisis management expertise through industry conferences, where Victoria had presented research on pharmaceutical risk management strategies. The initial consultation revealed that Biopharma Solutions faced regulatory challenges that could result in substantial penalties and suspension of their clinical development programs. "Victoria, we need crisis management expertise that understands both regulatory requirements and strategic communications," Kim had explained during their confidential consultation. Traditional public relations firms lack the regulatory knowledge required to navigate FDA compliance issues. Victoria's crisis management framework provided Biopharma Solutions with comprehensive response strategies that addressed regulatory compliance, stakeholder communications, and legal protection simultaneously. The protocols enabled the company to cooperate with FDA investigators while preserving their proprietary research and maintaining investor confidence throughout the regulatory review process. The crisis management consulting engagement generated $275,000 in fees over 4 months, with performance bonuses based on successful resolution of the regulatory issues. More importantly, the project demonstrated Victoria's ability to apply her intellectual property systems to complex, real-world challenges that exceeded the scope of traditional marketing consulting services. The success of these independent consulting projects created a cascade effect that expanded Victoria's professional reputation far beyond the pharmaceutical marketing niche, where she was primarily known through her Meridian employment. Industry publications began featuring articles about her regulatory expertise and crisis management methodologies. Professional conferences invited her to present research on pharmaceutical risk management and international market expansion strategies. Victoria's growing external recognition created increasingly complex challenges for managing her dual professional identity. Her consulting success required maintaining visibility within pharmaceutical industry networks, while preserving the confidentiality of her independent business activities to avoid conflicts with her Meridian employment obligations. She addressed this challenge through strategic personal branding that emphasized her academic credentials and industry expertise rather than her corporate affiliation. Professional conference presentations featured her as Dr. Victoria Chen, regulatory compliance expert and industry researcher, rather than identifying her specific employment relationship with Meridian Pharmaceuticals. The academic approach to her professional identity was supported by Victoria's ongoing research activities that extended far beyond her consulting engagements. She had published 15 peer-reviewed articles in pharmaceutical industry journals, covering topics including regulatory compliance optimization, predictive analytics for pharmaceutical marketing, and international market expansion strategies. The publications established her credibility as an independent expert whose knowledge transcended any single corporate affiliation. Victoria's research activities also provided additional revenue streams through licensing agreements with academic institutions and professional training organizations. Her regulatory compliance framework had been licensed by 3 pharmaceutical industry training programs, generating ongoing royalty payments while establishing industry standards that reinforced her competitive position. The training and certification programs created another dimension of Victoria's intellectual property business that operated entirely independently of her Meridian employment. Professional pharmaceutical marketers could obtain certification in her regulatory compliance methodologies through structured training programs that provided credentials recognized throughout the industry. The certification programs generated substantial revenue, while creating a network of professionals who were trained in Victoria's proprietary approaches. These certified professionals became advocates for her methodologies within their own organizations, creating organic demand for her consulting services and intellectual property licensing arrangements. Victoria's intellectual property empire had evolved into a comprehensive business ecosystem that included patent licensing, consulting services, training programs, academic research, and strategic partnerships. The ecosystem generated multiple revenue streams while providing strategic options that could support various professional scenarios, including independent consulting, academic positions, or executive roles with companies that valued her intellectual property assets. The financial performance of Victoria's independent business activities had exceeded her most optimistic projections. Annual revenue from her intellectual property licensing and consulting services approached $800,000, with growth projections indicating potential revenues exceeding $1.2 million within 2 years. The income levels provided financial security that transcended traditional employment relationships, while offering professional autonomy that corporate positions could not match. However, the most valuable aspect of Victoria's intellectual property business was not immediate revenue generation, but strategic leverage that could protect her professional interests when corporate loyalty proved insufficient. The non-compete clause that would soon create unprecedented financial obligations for Meridian represented only one element of the comprehensive protection strategy that Victoria had developed through her intellectual property portfolio. Victoria had also established strategic relationships with executive search firms that specialized in pharmaceutical industry placements. These relationships provided insights into industry trends, executive compensation benchmarks, and market opportunities that could support various career transition scenarios. The search consultants viewed Victoria as a highly desirable candidate whose regulatory expertise and intellectual property assets would command premium compensation packages. The executive search relationships revealed another dimension of Victoria's market value that her Meridian colleagues did not fully appreciate. Senior pharmaceutical executives with her combination of regulatory expertise, intellectual property portfolios, and industry recognition could command executive compensation packages ranging from $500,000 to $1.2 million annually, depending on company size and strategic requirements. Victoria's growing external recognition had also attracted attention from pharmaceutical industry investors and private equity firms that sought advisory relationships with executives who possessed specialized market knowledge. These advisory opportunities provided additional revenue streams while expanding her professional network to include financial professionals who could support various business development scenarios. The investor advisory relationships generated consulting fees ranging from $15,000 to $45,000 per engagement, depending on project scope and time requirements. More importantly, these relationships provided access to capital sources that could support expansion of Victoria's intellectual property business or potential acquisition opportunities that might arise through her consulting activities. Victoria's dual professional identity had created a complex but strategically advantageous situation, where her official corporate role provided industry access and professional credibility, while her independent business activities generated superior financial returns and strategic options. The arrangement required careful management to avoid conflicts of interest while maximizing the benefits of both professional identities. The management challenges were complicated by the growing recognition that Victoria's colleagues at Meridian were beginning to view her expertise as potentially threatening to their own career advancement opportunities. Younger executives like Madison Torres and Robert Harrison had built their professional reputations partly through association with innovative marketing approaches that Victoria had originally developed, but they were also beginning to recognize that Victoria's continued presence might limit their opportunities for further advancement. Jennifer Walsh, the Chief Human Resources Officer, had begun making subtle inquiries about Victoria's external professional activities during routine performance review discussions. The questions suggested growing awareness that Victoria possessed strategic capabilities and industry relationships that extended beyond her official Meridian responsibilities. Victoria, your expertise in regulatory compliance and international markets seems to generate significant external interest, Walsh had observed during a recent performance review meeting. Are you considering opportunities to share this knowledge through consulting or advisory roles? Quote, the question revealed that Meridian's leadership was beginning to understand that Victoria's value extended far beyond traditional marketing campaign execution. However, their recognition was occurring simultaneously with organizational pressure to reduce executive compensation costs and restructure senior management positions to accommodate younger executives who commanded lower salaries while possessing contemporary technical skills. Victoria understood that her position at Meridian had become increasingly precarious, despite her exceptional performance and strategic contributions. The combination of age-based discrimination pressures and concern about her independent professional capabilities created conditions where her employment termination was becoming not just possible, but probable. However, Victoria also understood that her 3 years of systematic preparation had created strategic advantages that would enable her to transform potential employment termination into professional opportunity. Her intellectual property portfolio, established consulting relationships, and industry recognition provided options that most executives never developed, while her carefully structured non-compete arrangements would ensure that any termination decision would create unprecedented financial obligations for Meridian. The foundation of her eventual triumph had been constructed through thousands of hours of preparation that occurred entirely beyond her colleagues. Awareness, creating strategic assets that would soon demonstrate their value when corporate discrimination threatened her professional security. The subtle shift in organizational dynamics at Meridian Pharmaceuticals became unmistakable during the October 2022 leadership retreat at the Fairmont Olympic Hotel. Victoria Chen observed the careful choreography of exclusion as younger executives gathered around Robert Harrison during networking breaks, engaging in conversations that ceased when she approached. The body language spoke volumes about changing power structures within the company, revealing alliance patterns that transcended formal organizational charts. Victoria had attended similar retreats for 14 years, watching them evolve from collaborative strategic planning sessions to carefully orchestrated political theater designed to reinforce predetermined decisions about organizational direction and personnel priorities. The transformation reflected broader changes in pharmaceutical industry culture, where traditional expertise was increasingly viewed as potential impediment to innovation rather than foundational knowledge that enabled sustainable growth. Jennifer Walsh orchestrated these dynamics with surgical precision, facilitating discussions that consistently emphasized the importance of contemporary leadership approaches, digital marketing expertise, and fresh perspectives that could accelerate Meridian's transformation into a modern pharmaceutical company. The language was aspirational and forward-looking, but Victoria recognized the underlying message about which types of professionals were considered valuable for future organizational success. During the retreat's second day, Victoria participated in a strategic planning session focused on international market expansion, the exact subject area where her intellectual property portfolio had generated the most substantial consulting revenue through her independent business activities. The irony was profound as she listened to colleagues discuss challenges and opportunities that she had already analyzed comprehensively through her proprietary research and consulting engagements. Madison Torres presented preliminary research on European pharmaceutical markets, displaying conclusions that closely paralleled findings from Victoria's confidential consulting work with Novus Therapeutics. The similarities suggested either remarkable coincidence or unauthorized access to Victoria's proprietary methodologies through sources that remained unclear. The presentation quality exceeded Madison's demonstrated analytical capabilities, raising questions about the origin of insights that formed the foundation of her strategic recommendations. European pharmaceutical markets represent significant growth opportunities for companies that understand regulatory complexity and competitive dynamics, Madison explained to the assembled executives. However, market entry requires specialized expertise that most American pharmaceutical companies lack internally. The assessment was accurate but represented knowledge that Madison had not possessed 6 months earlier, when Victoria had evaluated her understanding of international pharmaceutical markets. The sophisticated analysis suggested external consulting support or access to proprietary research that Madison had not disclosed to the leadership team. Victoria maintained professional composure while internally documenting potential intellectual property violations that could have serious legal implications if Madison had indeed accessed her confidential consulting materials. The presentation contained specific terminology and analytical frameworks that Victoria had developed independently and protected through patents and copyrights owned by her Delaware Limited Liability Company. David Kim followed Madison's presentation with financial projections for international expansion that incorporated cost estimates and timeline assumptions that closely matched parameters Victoria had established through her Novus Therapeutics engagement. The specificity of the financial modeling suggested access to detailed market intelligence that would not be available through public sources or standard consulting services. International market entry typically requires 18 to 36 months for regulatory approval processes, Kim explained, referencing timelines that reflected Victoria's proprietary acceleration methodologies rather than industry-standard approaches. However, companies with specialized regulatory expertise can potentially reduce these timelines through optimized compliance procedures. The timeline estimates specifically referenced acceleration capabilities that Victoria had developed through her regulatory compliance framework, intellectual property that was protected through patents and licensing agreements that prohibited unauthorized usage. The financial projections suggested implementation of her proprietary methodologies without acknowledgement of intellectual property rights or licensing requirements. Victoria recognized that she faced a strategic decision point that would determine both her immediate response to potential intellectual property violations and her longer-term approach to protecting her professional interests at Meridian. Confronting the unauthorized usage directly would reveal her independent consulting activities and potentially create conflicts of interest regarding her employment obligations. However, allowing the violations to continue would enable colleagues to benefit from her intellectual property without compensation or recognition. She chose a measured approach that would gather additional evidence while preserving her strategic options for future legal action. Victoria began documenting similarities between her proprietary methodologies and presentations by Meridian colleagues, creating comprehensive records that could support intellectual property violation claims if necessary. The documentation process revealed the extensive scope of potential unauthorized usage of her intellectual property across multiple departments at Meridian. Her regulatory compliance frameworks appeared to influence compliance procedures that the legal department had implemented. Her predictive analytics methodologies seemed to inform marketing campaign targeting approaches that the digital marketing team claimed as original innovations. Her crisis management protocols appeared to guide communication strategies that the Public Relations Department had adopted. The pattern suggested systematic appropriation of Victoria's intellectual property through mechanisms that remained unclear but represented substantial, unauthorized value creation for Meridian through her proprietary innovations. The financial impact could be measured in millions of dollars of improved operational efficiency, reduced regulatory risk, and enhanced marketing effectiveness that resulted from implementation of her copyrighted and patented methodologies. Victoria's growing awareness of intellectual property violations coincided with escalating signals that her position at Meridian was becoming increasingly vulnerable to organizational restructuring. The leadership retreat concluded with announcements about efficiency initiatives, cost optimization programs, and strategic realignment efforts that historically preceded executive terminations disguised as organizational improvements. Harrison's closing presentation emphasized the importance of building leadership teams that reflected contemporary market dynamics and possessed technical capabilities that aligned with emerging industry trends. The language carefully avoided explicit references to age or experience levels, but the implications were unmistakable for anyone who understood the demographic composition of current leadership compared to newly hired executives. Meridian must continue evolving to remain competitive in rapidly changing pharmaceutical markets, Harrison declared during his keynote address. This evolution requires leadership teams that understand contemporary marketing approaches, possess digital marketing expertise, and can connect with healthcare professionals who increasingly rely on modern communication channels. The evolution narrative provided justification for personnel changes while obscuring the discriminatory basis of decision-making processes that prioritized youth and contemporary credentials over proven expertise and measurable performance results. Victoria had observed similar rhetoric during previous organizational transformations that resulted in systematic replacement of experienced professionals with younger alternatives. Following the leadership retreat, Victoria accelerated her strategic preparations for potential employment termination, while simultaneously investigating the scope of intellectual property violations that appeared to be occurring across multiple Meridian departments. The dual challenge required extraordinary discretion and careful coordination of legal research, business development activities, and evidence documentation that could support various response scenarios. Her intellectual property attorney, Michael Thompson of Thompson & Associates, confirmed that the unauthorized usage patterns Victoria had documented represented serious violations of patent, copyright, and trade secret protections that could result in substantial financial damages and injunctive relief requiring cessation of infringing activities. Victoria, the evidence you have documented suggests systematic appropriation of your intellectual property across multiple business functions, Thompson explained during their confidential consultation. The financial damages could reach several $1 million, and injunctive relief could severely disrupt Meridian's operations if they are indeed dependent on your proprietary methodologies. Thompson's assessment validated Victoria's strategic decision to document potential violations while preparing comprehensive legal responses that could be implemented if Meridian proceeded with employment termination. The intellectual property violations provided additional leverage beyond the non-compete compensation clause, creating multiple avenues for financial recovery and operational disruption that could make her termination extraordinarily expensive for the company. Victoria also consulted with executive search specialists who confirmed that her combination of pharmaceutical expertise, intellectual property assets, and industry recognition positioned her as an exceptionally desirable candidate for senior executive positions throughout the pharmaceutical industry. The market assessment provided confidence that employment termination from Meridian would create opportunities rather than career disruption. Dr. Sarah Williams of Executive Search Partners, a firm specializing in pharmaceutical executive placements, provided comprehensive market analysis that confirmed Victoria's strategic value across multiple industry segments. Victoria, your regulatory expertise combined with your intellectual property portfolio creates a unique competitive advantage that pharmaceutical companies would pay premium compensation to acquire, Williams explained during their strategic planning session. Executive positions matching your qualifications typically command compensation packages ranging from $650,000 to $3 million annually, depending on company size and strategic requirements. The compensation benchmarks exceeded Victoria's current salary by substantial margins, while providing professional autonomy and strategic recognition that her Meridian position could never offer, given the organizational dynamics she now faced. The market analysis confirmed that employment termination would represent opportunity rather than professional setback. Victoria's strategic preparations during this period extended beyond immediate employment concerns to include long-term business development planning that could transform her intellectual property portfolio into comprehensive consulting and technology licensing enterprises. She had identified market opportunities that could generate annual revenues exceeding $2 million within 3 years through systematic expansion of her regulatory compliance, predictive analytics, and crisis management technologies. The business development planning included strategic partnerships with technology companies that could integrate her proprietary algorithms into comprehensive pharmaceutical marketing platforms, licensing agreements with consulting firms that could expand global distribution of her methodologies, and certification programs that could establish industry standards based on her innovations. Victoria's intellectual property empire had evolved beyond individual consulting projects to encompass systematic market transformation that could influence how pharmaceutical companies approach regulatory compliance, marketing optimization, and crisis management across the entire industry. The scope of potential impact validated her strategic decision to invest years of personal resources in developing independent capabilities rather than depending solely on traditional employment relationships for professional security. The mounting evidence of organizational discrimination at Meridian coincided with external recognition that further validated Victoria's strategic positioning within the pharmaceutical industry. She received invitations to serve on advisory boards for biotechnology companies, speak at industry conferences about regulatory innovation, and contribute to academic research programs focused on pharmaceutical market dynamics. The external recognition created additional strategic options while reinforcing her credibility as an independent expert, whose knowledge transcended any single corporate affiliation. Professional organizations sought her involvement in developing industry standards for regulatory compliance, marketing ethics, and international expansion strategies that could influence pharmaceutical industry practices for decades. Victoria's growing influence within professional networks also provided intelligence about industry trends and competitive dynamics that informed her strategic planning while creating opportunities for consulting engagements and partnership development. The network effects demonstrated how individual expertise could create cascading influence that extended far beyond immediate business relationships. The combination of mounting discrimination pressures at Meridian and expanding external opportunities created conditions where Victoria's eventual employment termination would represent professional liberation rather than career disruption. Her systematic preparations had transformed potential vulnerability into strategic advantage through intellectual property development, industry relationship building, and comprehensive legal planning that anticipated various confrontation scenarios. However, Victoria also understood that the confrontation phase would require extraordinary skill in managing legal, financial, and professional relationships that could determine both immediate outcomes and long-term industry reputation. The stakes extended beyond personal financial recovery to encompass broader questions about how experienced professionals could protect themselves against age-based discrimination, while maintaining dignity and professional standards throughout complex conflict resolution processes. Victoria's recognition of mounting threats at Meridian represented more than awareness of personal employment risks. It reflected sophisticated understanding of industry-wide demographic shifts, organizational culture changes, and competitive dynamics that were reshaping professional opportunities throughout the pharmaceutical sector. Her strategic response would soon demonstrate how individual professionals could not only survive these transformations, but leverage them to create unprecedented opportunities for professional advancement and industry influence. The foundation of her eventual triumph had been constructed through years of systematic preparation that extended far beyond traditional career development activities. Victoria had built comprehensive intellectual property portfolios, established extensive industry relationships, and developed strategic capabilities that would soon enable her to transform corporate discrimination into professional empowerment, while setting precedents that could influence how experienced professionals protect themselves against similar challenges throughout their careers. The December 2022 performance review meeting occurred in Jennifer Walsh's corner office, a space designed to convey authority through carefully selected contemporary artwork and minimalist furniture that suggested efficiency and forward-thinking leadership. Victoria Chen entered the meeting prepared for what she recognized would be a carefully orchestrated attempt to document performance deficiencies that could justify predetermined termination decisions. Walsh had scheduled the performance review for late Friday afternoon, a timing choice that reflected tactical consideration of Victoria's emotional state and available response options. The isolation of end-of-week scheduling would limit Victoria's ability to seek immediate counsel or support, while maximizing the psychological impact of negative performance feedback, delivered when she would have the weekend to contemplate her professional vulnerability. The performance review documentation that Walsh presented contained carefully crafted language that reinterpreted Victoria's exceptional achievements as evidence of professional limitations that threatened Meridian's strategic objectives. Her regulatory compliance innovations were characterized as resistance to contemporary marketing approaches. Her predictive analytics capabilities were described as over-reliance on historical data that limited creative campaign development. Her crisis management expertise was portrayed as excessive caution that constrained organizational risk tolerance. Victoria, while your technical expertise remains valuable, we have concerns about your alignment with our evolving strategic direction. Walsh began, reading from prepared notes that had clearly been reviewed by legal counsel to minimize discrimination liability, while establishing grounds for termination. The leadership team believes that your approaches may be limiting our ability to implement innovative marketing strategies. The criticism represented sophisticated gaslighting designed to undermine Victoria's confidence while creating official documentation that could justify employment termination as performance-related rather than discriminatory. Walsh's presentation systematically reframed Victoria's greatest strengths as professional weaknesses that impeded organizational progress. Victoria recognized the psychological manipulation tactics being employed and maintained professional composure while internally documenting statements that revealed the discriminatory basis of Walsh's assessment. The performance review represented an attempt to establish legal cover for decisions that had already been made through processes that violated employment law and professional ethics. Jennifer, I would appreciate specific examples of situations where my approaches have limited innovative marketing strategies. Victoria responded calmly, forcing Walsh to provide concrete evidence rather than accepting vague accusations that could not be substantiated through objective performance metrics. Walsh consulted her notes before responding with examples that revealed fundamental misunderstanding of pharmaceutical marketing requirements and regulatory compliance obligations. She criticized Victoria's insistence on FDA approval processes that were legally mandated, characterized Victoria's international expansion expertise as excessive complexity that confused marketing teams, and suggested that Victoria's crisis management protocols created unnecessary bureaucracy that slowed response times. The criticisms demonstrated that Walsh lacked basic understanding of pharmaceutical industry requirements and regulatory obligations that governed marketing activities. Her assessment treated legal compliance requirements as optional procedures that could be modified to accommodate creative preferences, revealing dangerous ignorance that could expose Meridian to substantial regulatory penalties and legal liability. Victoria, Madison Torres has demonstrated that contemporary marketing approaches can achieve superior results while reducing operational complexity. Walsh continued, referencing achievements that directly resulted from implementation of Victoria's proprietary methodologies without acknowledging the intellectual property source of the innovations. The comparison to Madison Torres revealed another dimension of the systematic appropriation of Victoria's intellectual property that was occurring throughout Meridian's organization. Walsh was attributing superior performance to Madison, while that performance resulted from unauthorized usage of Victoria's copyrighted and patented methodologies that Madison had accessed through unclear channels. Victoria documented Walsh's statements while recognizing that the performance review was creating evidence that would support both wrongful termination claims and intellectual property litigation that could result in substantial financial damages for Meridian. The company was simultaneously discriminating against her while appropriating her intellectual property, creating multiple legal violations that significantly increased potential liability. Jennifer, I noticed that several examples of superior performance by other team members involve methodologies that I developed independently and protected through patents and copyrights. Victoria stated carefully, establishing official notice of intellectual property violations that could strengthen future legal actions. Walsh appeared momentarily confused by Victoria's reference to intellectual property rights, suggesting that she was unaware of the legal implications of appropriating Victoria's proprietary methodologies. The confusion revealed that Meridian's leadership had not properly investigated the ownership status of innovations they were implementing throughout their organization. The performance review concluded with Walsh delivering prepared statements about performance improvement requirements and timeline expectations that were clearly designed to create impossible standards that would justify termination regardless of Victoria's actual performance. The improvement plan included metrics that were subjective rather than measurable, deadlines that were unrealistic given regulatory requirements, and collaboration expectations that required working with colleagues who were actively appropriating her intellectual property. Victoria accepted the performance improvement documentation while understanding that it represented the final phase of a termination process that had been designed to minimize legal liability while maximizing psychological pressure. The improvement plan was not intended to be achievable but rather to create official justification for employment termination when she inevitably failed to meet impossible standards. However, Victoria had spent months preparing for this exact scenario and possessed comprehensive documentation of her exceptional performance, evidence of intellectual property violations, and strategic options that would transform her termination into the most expensive personnel decision in Meridian's corporate history. Following the performance review meeting, Victoria implemented the final phase of her strategic preparations by accelerating documentation of intellectual property violations while coordinating with legal counsel to prepare comprehensive litigation strategies. The evidence she had collected over several months revealed systematic appropriation of her innovations across multiple departments, creating potential damages that could reach tens of millions of dollars. Michael Thompson, her intellectual property attorney, confirmed that the evidence Victoria had documented would support claims for patent infringement, copyright violation, trade secret misappropriation, and unjust enrichment that could result in injunctive relief requiring cessation of infringing activities throughout Meridian's operations. Victoria, the scope of intellectual property violations you have documented suggests that Meridian has built significant portions of their competitive advantages on unauthorized usage of your proprietary innovations, Thompson explained during their strategy planning session. The financial impact of injunctive relief could be devastating for their business operations. Thompson's assessment validated Victoria's strategic decision to document intellectual property violations while preparing for employment termination. The combination of wrongful termination claims and intellectual property litigation would create unprecedented financial exposure for Meridian while providing Victoria with extraordinary leverage for negotiating resolution terms. Victoria also finalized arrangements with executive search consultants who had identified multiple senior executive opportunities that would provide substantial compensation increases while offering professional recognition that Meridian had denied her, despite her exceptional contributions. The market opportunities confirmed that her termination would represent professional advancement rather than career disruption. Dr. Sarah Williams of Executive Search Partners had coordinated preliminary discussions with 3 pharmaceutical companies that sought executives with Victoria's combination of regulatory expertise and intellectual property assets. The opportunities included chief marketing officer positions with compensation packages exceeding $900,000 annually, plus equity participation that could generate additional millions in long-term value. Victoria, your intellectual property portfolio creates unique value propositions that pharmaceutical companies are eager to access through executive recruitment, Williams explained during their final preparation session. These organizations understand that hiring executives with established patent portfolios provides competitive advantages that cannot be replicated through internal development. The executive opportunities provided Victoria with strategic alternatives that would enable her to continue developing her intellectual property empire while receiving appropriate compensation and recognition for her innovations. The positions offered professional autonomy and resource access that that could accelerate the growth of her proprietary technologies while establishing her as a recognized industry leader. Victoria's comprehensive preparations during this period extended beyond immediate employment concerns to include strategic business development planning that could transform potential termination into unprecedented professional opportunities. She had established partnerships with consulting firms, technology companies, and academic institutions that could provide platforms for expanding her intellectual property businesses. The business development initiatives included licensing agreements that would generate ongoing royalty revenues, consulting engagements that could exceed her current salary within 6 months, and research collaborations that could produce additional patentable innovations. The diverse revenue streams would provide financial security that transcended traditional employment relationships while offering creative fulfillment that corporate positions could not match. Victoria's strategic positioning had also attracted attention from pharmaceutical industry investors who recognized the commercial potential of her intellectual property portfolio. Preliminary discussions with venture capital firms had identified investment opportunities that could provide capital for expanding her technologies while maintaining her ownership of core innovations. The investment discussions revealed that Victoria's intellectual property assets could support valuations exceeding $15 million for a comprehensive technology company built around her regulatory compliance, predictive analytics, and crisis management innovations. The potential valuations confirmed that her years of systematic intellectual property development had created assets with extraordinary commercial value. However, the most significant aspect of Victoria's preparations was not financial planning but psychological readiness for the confrontation that would soon demonstrate her transformation from vulnerable employee to empowered entrepreneur. The termination that Meridian intended as professional humiliation would instead become a catalyst for industry transformation that would establish Victoria as a pioneering example of how experienced professionals could protect themselves against discrimination while building independent business empires. The psychological preparation required confronting fears about professional rejection, financial security, and industry reputation that had historically made employment termination devastating for senior executives. Victoria had addressed these concerns through comprehensive planning that eliminated uncertainties while creating excitement about opportunities that traditional employment could never provide. Victoria's mental preparation also involved anticipating the emotional dynamics that would accompany her eventual confrontation with Meridian's leadership. The executives who had discriminated against her would soon discover that their actions had awakened a strategic adversary whose capabilities exceeded their comprehension, and whose preparation would make their discrimination the most expensive mistake in their professional careers. The confrontation phase would require extraordinary discipline in managing her emotional responses, while executing complex legal and business strategies that could determine both immediate outcomes and long-term industry influence. Victoria understood that her handling of the termination process would establish precedents for how experienced professionals could respond to age-based discrimination while maintaining dignity and professional standards. Victoria's recognition that the confrontation was becoming inevitable coincided with final preparations that would ensure her termination would trigger consequences that Meridian's leadership could not anticipate. The non-compete compensation clause represented only the most visible element of financial obligations that would result from their discrimination, while intellectual property litigation would create operational disruptions that could threaten the company's competitive position. The strategic preparations also included media relations planning that could transform her termination into industry-wide discussions about age discrimination, intellectual property protection, and professional empowerment that would influence pharmaceutical industry employment practices for years. Victoria understood that her confrontation with Meridian represented opportunities to address systemic issues that affected thousands of experienced professionals throughout the industry. Victoria's final preparations during this period included personal arrangements that would enable her to manage the stress and complexity of extended legal proceedings while maintaining her professional responsibilities and business development activities. The comprehensive planning reflected her understanding that successful confrontation of corporate discrimination required not just legal and financial resources but also personal resilience and strategic patience. The mounting pressure from Meridian's discrimination tactics had paradoxically strengthened Victoria's resolve while providing additional evidence that would support her legal claims. Every attempt to undermine her confidence had instead reinforced her determination to demonstrate how experienced professionals could transform corporate betrayal into professional triumph through strategic preparation and systematic execution. Victoria's transformation during this period reflected more than individual career development, but represented broader questions about how skilled professionals could build independent capabilities that transcended traditional employment relationships. Her approach would soon demonstrate that age-based discrimination could be converted into competitive advantages through intellectual property development, strategic planning, and comprehensive legal protection. The foundation of her eventual triumph had been constructed through systematic preparation that anticipated every aspect of the confrontation, while creating strategic options that would enable her to achieve outcomes that exceeded her most optimistic expectations. Victoria Chen was preparing to demonstrate how individual professionals could not only survive corporate discrimination, but leverage it to create unprecedented opportunities for industry leadership and financial empowerment. January 2023 marked the final phase of Victoria Chen's comprehensive preparation for the inevitable confrontation with Meridian Pharmaceuticals. The performance improvement plan that Jennifer Walsh had imposed during the December review meeting contained deliberately impossible requirements that would provide legal justification for termination regardless of Victoria's actual achievements. This transparent manipulation confirmed that her employment relationship had entered its terminal phase, requiring activation of strategic responses she had developed over 3 years of methodical planning. Victoria's home office had transformed into a sophisticated command center, coordinating multiple parallel initiatives that would soon converge into a comprehensive assault on Meridian's financial stability and competitive position. Patent documentation covered one wall, organized chronologically, to demonstrate the systematic development of intellectual property that Meridian had appropriated without authorization. Financial records from her consulting engagements occupied another area, providing evidence of the commercial value her innovations generated when properly licensed and implemented. The centerpiece of her preparation was a leather portfolio containing the employment agreement that would soon destroy Meridian's quarterly earnings projections. Victoria had reviewed every clause of the 15-year-old document with forensic precision, identifying provisions that her former colleagues had clearly forgotten, but would soon remember with devastating clarity. The non-compete compensation clause represented only the most visible element of financial obligations that would result from her termination. Michael Thompson of Thompson & Associates had completed comprehensive legal analysis that confirmed Victoria's strategic position exceeded even her optimistic projections. The combination of wrongful termination claims, intellectual property violations, and contractual breach issues created multiple avenues for financial recovery that could aggregate into unprecedented corporate liability for age-based discrimination. Victoria, the legal documentation you have assembled represents the most comprehensive intellectual property violation case I have encountered in pharmaceutical industry litigation, Thompson explained during their final strategy session. The evidence demonstrates systematic appropriation of your innovations across multiple business functions, creating potential damages that could reach $40 to $60 million through lost licensing revenues and punitive assessments. Thompson's analysis revealed that Meridian's unauthorized usage of Victoria's proprietary methodologies had generated cost savings and revenue enhancements that far exceeded the $8 million non-compete compensation clause. The intellectual property litigation would seek recovery of these unauthorized benefits while establishing injunctive relief that could disrupt Meridian's operations until they developed alternative approaches or negotiated appropriate licensing agreements. The intellectual property case would also expose the discriminatory basis of Victoria's termination by demonstrating that her innovations had been essential to Meridian's competitive success while she was simultaneously being characterized as professionally obsolete. The contradiction between her measurable contributions and her alleged performance deficiencies would provide compelling evidence of age-based discrimination that violated federal employment law. Victoria's comprehensive documentation included recordings of meetings where colleagues discussed appropriating her methodologies, emails containing her proprietary analysis being shared without attribution, and financial reports demonstrating improved performance resulting from implementation of her innovations. The evidence created an irrefutable foundation for legal claims while exposing the systematic nature of both discrimination and intellectual property violations. Dr. Sarah Williams of Executive Search Partners had finalized arrangements for Victoria's transition to independent consulting and potential executive opportunities that would begin immediately following her termination from Meridian. The market response to Victoria's availability had exceeded expectations, with pharmaceutical companies competing to access her intellectual property portfolio and regulatory expertise through lucrative consulting agreements. Victoria, 3 pharmaceutical companies have submitted preliminary offers for comprehensive consulting engagements that would provide annual revenues exceeding $1.2 million, Williams reported during their transition planning session. These organizations recognize that your intellectual property assets provide competitive advantages worth substantially more than traditional consulting fees. The consulting opportunities reflected industry recognition that Victoria's innovations had become essential technologies for contemporary pharmaceutical marketing, while remaining available exclusively through direct engagement with her independent business enterprise. The market validation confirmed that her termination from Meridian would represent professional liberation rather than career disruption. Victoria's consulting pipeline included regulatory compliance projects for international market expansion, predictive analytics implementations for campaign optimization, and crisis management protocol development for companies seeking to minimize regulatory and reputational risks. The diverse project portfolio would provide both immediate revenue and strategic relationships that could support long-term business development objectives. The strategic value of her intellectual property had also attracted attention from technology acquisition firms that specialized in pharmaceutical industry investments. Preliminary discussions had identified potential valuations exceeding $20 million for comprehensive licensing agreements that would provide ongoing royalty revenues while maintaining her ownership of core innovations. However, the most significant aspect of Victoria's final preparations was psychological conditioning for the emotional challenges that would accompany her confrontation with former colleagues who had betrayed professional relationships while appropriating her intellectual property. The termination process would require extraordinary emotional discipline to execute complex legal strategies while maintaining dignity and professional standards throughout extended conflict resolution proceedings. Victoria had worked with executive coaching specialists who focused on high-stakes professional transitions to develop psychological frameworks that would enable her to manage stress, maintain strategic focus, and project confidence during confrontational interactions with Meridian's leadership team. The coaching preparation addressed emotional triggers that could undermine strategic decision-making, while reinforcing mental approaches that would support optimal performance during critical negotiations. The psychological preparation also included media relations training that would enable Victoria to communicate effectively with industry publications and professional networks about her transition from Meridian, while maintaining confidentiality of sensitive legal strategies. The media relations component was essential, given that her confrontation with age-based discrimination would likely generate significant industry attention and could influence employment practices throughout the pharmaceutical sector. Victoria's media strategy focused on positioning her termination as an opportunity to establish independent consulting and technology licensing enterprises that would provide superior service to pharmaceutical companies while advancing industry standards for regulatory compliance and marketing effectiveness. The narrative emphasized professional empowerment and innovation rather than victimization or retaliation, maintaining credibility while building support for her new business initiatives. The final phase of Victoria's preparation included coordinating with expert witnesses who would provide testimony supporting her legal claims while validating the commercial value of her intellectual property innovations. The expert witness team included former FDA regulatory officials, pharmaceutical industry executives, and intellectual property valuation specialists who could provide authoritative analysis of both legal violations and financial damages. Dr. Patricia Martinez, former deputy director of the FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, agreed to provide expert testimony regarding the regulatory compliance value of Victoria's innovations and the potential consequences of their unauthorized usage. Martinez's analysis confirmed that Victoria's frameworks provided regulatory protections worth millions of dollars annually through violation prevention and accelerated approval processes. Victoria's regulatory compliance methodologies represent breakthrough innovations that could transform how pharmaceutical companies manage FDA relationships and international market expansion, Martinez explained during her expert analysis preparation. The unauthorized appropriation of these innovations represents both intellectual property violations and potential regulatory risks for organizations that implement them without proper authorization. Martinez's expert testimony would establish the regulatory significance of Victoria's innovations while demonstrating that their unauthorized usage created compliance risks that could expose Meridian to substantial FDA penalties and regulatory sanctions. The testimony would support both intellectual property claims and wrongful termination arguments by proving Victoria's exceptional professional value. Victoria's preparation also included financial planning for extended legal proceedings that could require significant resources while her consulting businesses were establishing market position and generating steady revenues. The financial planning addressed potential cash flow challenges during litigation while ensuring adequate resources for both legal expenses and business development investments. The financial strategy included credit facilities secured by her intellectual property assets, revenue projections from confirmed consulting engagements, and cost management approaches that would maintain her standard of living while supporting strategic business objectives. The comprehensive financial planning eliminated concerns about resource availability during legal proceedings while providing flexibility for opportunistic business investments. Victoria's systematic preparation extended to operational planning for managing her independent consulting businesses while simultaneously pursuing legal claims against Meridian. The operational coordination required establishing administrative systems, hiring specialized staff, and developing project management capabilities that could support multiple simultaneous client engagements while maintaining the confidentiality and quality standards that pharmaceutical industry clients demanded. The operational planning included establishing secure information management systems that would protect client confidential information while supporting her legal documentation requirements. The systems integration required sophisticated cybersecurity measures and professional administrative support that could handle both consulting project coordination and legal proceeding management simultaneously. Victoria had also prepared detailed transition plans for clients who had been accessing her expertise through her Meridian employment relationship, but would need to establish direct consulting agreements following her termination. The client transition planning ensured continuity of strategic projects while providing immediate revenue streams that would support her independent business operations. The client transition process revealed another dimension of Victoria's strategic value that Meridian's leadership had failed to appreciate. Several major pharmaceutical companies had developed dependency relationships on Victoria's expertise that existed independently of her corporate affiliation, creating immediate market opportunities for her independent consulting enterprise. During this final preparation phase, Victoria received intelligence suggesting that Madison Torres was being positioned to assume her chief marketing officer responsibilities following her anticipated termination. The intelligence confirmed Victoria's assessment that her termination was predetermined rather than performance-related, while providing additional evidence of age-based discrimination that prioritized contemporary credentials over proven expertise and measurable contributions. The Madison Torres promotion would also create operational challenges for Meridian, given that many of their strategic marketing advantages resulted from Victoria's proprietary innovations that would be withdrawn upon her termination. Madison possessed technical skills in digital marketing, but lacked the regulatory expertise and industry relationships that had enabled Victoria to develop comprehensive competitive advantages. Victoria's final strategic preparation included contingency planning for various termination scenarios that could range from immediate dismissal to extended performance improvement processes designed to force her resignation. Each scenario required different tactical responses while maintaining strategic coherence toward objectives of financial recovery, professional vindication, and industry influence. The contingency planning also addressed potential settlement discussions that might occur once Meridian's leadership recognized the full scope of their legal and financial exposure. Victoria had established parameters for settlement negotiations that would provide appropriate compensation, while ensuring adequate deterrent effects to discourage similar discrimination against other experienced professionals. However, Victoria's preference was for full legal proceedings that would create public precedents regarding age-based discrimination, while establishing industry standards for intellectual property protection that could benefit other professionals facing similar challenges. The precedent-setting potential of her case represented opportunities to influence employment practices throughout the pharmaceutical industry, while advancing broader social objectives regarding professional discrimination. Victoria's comprehensive preparation during this final phase reflected more than individual career planning, but embodied systematic approaches for professional empowerment that could provide frameworks for other experienced professionals facing age-based discrimination. Her methodologies demonstrated how strategic intellectual property development, comprehensive legal planning, and systematic business development could transform potential career disruption into unprecedented professional opportunities. The scope of Victoria's preparation exceeded anything typically undertaken by executives facing employment termination, reflecting both the severity of discrimination she faced and her determination to establish precedents that would protect other professionals while advancing her own strategic objectives. The comprehensive approach would soon demonstrate how individual professionals could build independent capabilities that transcended traditional employment relationships, while providing superior financial security and professional autonomy. As February 2023 approached, Victoria Chen stood ready to transform her impending termination from Meridian Pharmaceuticals into the catalyst for professional achievements that would establish her as a pioneering example of how experienced professionals could respond to discrimination while building independent business empires that exceeded the scope and influence of traditional corporate employment relationships. The February morning when Victoria Chen received the final termination summons carried the crisp precision of a Seattle winter, with clear skies that seemed to mirror the clarity of strategic vision she had developed through 3 years of systematic preparation. The text message from Jennifer Walsh arrived at precisely 9:15 a.m., requesting her immediate presence in Conference Room A for what was euphemistically described as a, quote, strategic consultation regarding organizational realignment. Quote, Victoria understood that this meeting represented the culmination of months of discriminatory maneuvering designed to remove her from Meridian Pharmaceuticals while maintaining legal cover for age-based termination decisions. However, her comprehensive preparation had transformed this intended professional execution into the opening movement of a strategic counteroffensive that would demonstrate the catastrophic cost of underestimating experienced professionals who possess both intellectual property assets and sophisticated legal preparation. She entered the conference room carrying a single leather portfolio that contained documentation capable of destroying Meridian's quarterly financial projections, while establishing precedents for intellectual property protection that would influence pharmaceutical industry employment practices for decades. The portfolio represented more than legal evidence. It embodied years of strategic planning that had anticipated every aspect of this confrontation while creating options that would enable her to achieve outcomes exceeding her most optimistic expectations. Robert Harrison sat at the head of the mahogany table with the nervous energy of someone about to deliver news he found personally distasteful but organizationally necessary. Jennifer Walsh occupied her customary position with prepared documentation that would attempt to characterize Victoria's termination as strategic restructuring rather than discriminatory personnel management. David Kim avoided direct eye contact while reviewing financial projections that would soon require dramatic revision. Madison Torres was notably absent from the meeting, a tactical decision that revealed management's awareness that her presence would underscore the age-based nature of succession planning that had driven Victoria's termination. The absence confirmed that Meridian's leadership understood the discriminatory implications of their personnel decisions, while attempting to minimize evidence of their illegal motivations. Victoria, thank you for joining us this morning. Harrison began with practiced corporate diplomacy that failed to conceal his underlying discomfort with the termination process. We need to discuss significant organizational changes that will reshape Meridian's executive structure to align with our strategic evolution and contemporary market requirements. The language reflected careful legal consultation, designed to frame discriminatory termination as forward-thinking strategic planning, while avoiding explicit references to age or experience levels that could support employment law violations. Victoria recognized the tactical approach while simultaneously documenting statements that would provide evidence for wrongful termination claims. Walsh assumed control of the presentation with prepared remarks that systematically reinterpreted Victoria's exceptional contributions as evidence of professional limitations that threatened organizational progress. The performance evaluation methodology represented sophisticated gaslighting designed to justify predetermined termination decisions through retrospective reframing of measurable achievements as strategic impediments. Victoria, our comprehensive evaluation indicates that your approach to pharmaceutical marketing reflects traditional methodologies that may limit our ability to implement innovative strategies required for contemporary market competition, Walsh explained while consulting notes that had clearly been reviewed by employment law specialists to minimize discrimination liability. The criticism directly contradicted objective performance metrics that demonstrated Victoria's innovations had generated millions of dollars in improved efficiency, regulatory compliance, and competitive advantages for Meridian. Walsh's assessment represented deliberate misrepresentation of documented achievements, while creating official justification for discriminatory personnel decisions. Victoria maintained professional composure while internally recognizing that each statement Walsh made was strengthening legal claims for wrongful termination, age discrimination, and retaliation that would soon devastate Meridian's legal position. The systematic nature of their misrepresentations was creating comprehensive evidence of discriminatory intent while revealing their fundamental misunderstanding of her strategic preparation. Jennifer, I appreciate your assessment of my contributions to Meridian's success. Victoria responded calmly while opening her leather portfolio to access documentation that would soon transform the meeting's power dynamics. However, I believe there may be some misunderstanding about the nature and ownership of the methodologies that have generated those contributions. The reference to methodology ownership created visible confusion around the table, as executives exchanged uncertain glances that suggested they had not anticipated intellectual property discussions during what they expected to be a routine termination meeting. Their confusion revealed fundamental ignorance about the legal implications of appropriating proprietary innovations while simultaneously terminating their creator. Victoria withdrew a bound document from her portfolio and placed it carefully on the table where all participants could observe its official legal formatting and comprehensive pagination. The document represented only the executive's summary of intellectual property evidence that would soon create unprecedented financial exposure for Meridian through multiple legal violations. This documentation establishes my ownership of the regulatory compliance frameworks, predictive analytics methodologies, and crisis management protocols that have been implemented throughout Meridian's operations during the past 3 years. Victoria explained with professional precision that contrasted sharply with the growing panic evident in her colleagues' expressions. Harrison leaned forward to examine the document while his confident demeanor dissolved into uncertainty and concern. The intellectual property implications were becoming clear, and their carefully planned personnel change was transforming into a potential legal catastrophe that could threaten Meridian's competitive position and financial stability. Victoria, our legal team reviewed your employment agreements and determined that innovations developed during your tenure are corporate intellectual property. Kim interjected with false confidence that revealed his ignorance of the actual legal documentation governing Victoria's employment relationship and intellectual property rights. Victoria smiled slightly while withdrawing additional documents that would demolish Kim's misunderstanding of her strategic legal position. The intellectual property documentation she had prepared included patents filed independently, copyrights registered under her personal name, and trade secret protections established through her Delaware limited liability company rather than through Meridian's corporate structure. David, I believe your legal team may have overlooked certain aspects of my employment agreement that I negotiated 15 years ago. Victoria replied while distributing copies of patent documentation that established her exclusive ownership of innovations that Meridian had been using without authorization or compensation. The patent portfolio contained 47 separate applications covering methodologies that had become essential to Meridian's regulatory compliance, marketing effectiveness, and crisis management capabilities. The unauthorized usage represented millions of dollars in licensing fees that should have been paid to Victoria's intellectual property company, while creating potential damages that could aggregate into unprecedented corporate liability. Walsh frantically consulted her tablet computer while searching for legal documentation that might contradict Victoria's intellectual property claims. The search revealed that Meridian's Human Resources Department had failed to conduct adequate due diligence regarding intellectual property ownership before implementing discriminatory termination procedures. Victoria, even if certain methodologies involve your independent intellectual property, your employment termination can proceed according to standard corporate restructuring procedures. Walsh stated with diminishing confidence while recognizing that her legal position was collapsing under the weight of evidence she had failed to anticipate. Victoria nodded politely while withdrawing the employment agreement that would soon create the most devastating financial consequence of their termination decision. The 15-year-old document contained provisions that her former colleagues had clearly forgotten but would soon remember with catastrophic clarity. "Jennifer, I agree that my employment termination can proceed according to our agreement," Victoria replied while opening to the non-compete section that would transform their personnel decision into a corporate financial disaster. "However, I should remind you of the compensation provisions that activate when non-compete restrictions are implemented." The non-compete clause occupied 2 full pages of the employment agreement and included financial considerations that reflected the intellectual property restrictions Victoria would accept in exchange for exclusive usage rights that would benefit Meridian. The compensation structure had seemed reasonable 15 years earlier, when executives viewed Victoria as a traditional marketing professional whose primary value involved campaign execution and client relationship management. Harrison read the non-compete compensation provisions with growing horror, as he realized that their termination decision would trigger financial obligations totaling $8 million payable within 90 days of employment termination. The compensation represented intellectual property licensing fees that recognized Victoria's contribution to Meridian's competitive advantages while preventing her from utilizing those innovations elsewhere. $8 million. Kim whispered while calculating the devastating impact on quarterly earnings projections that had not anticipated extraordinary executive termination expenses. The non-compete compensation would eliminate Meridian's projected profits, while creating cash flow challenges that could threaten their ability to meet other financial obligations. Victoria maintained professional composure while observing the psychological impact of their growing awareness that discriminatory termination decisions carried unprecedented financial consequences that their legal and financial planning had failed to anticipate. The $8 million non-compete compensation represented only the most visible element of their strategic miscalculation. "Robert, the non-compete compensation reflects our mutual agreement that preventing me from working elsewhere would provide Meridian with exclusive access to intellectual property worth substantially more than $8 million annually," Victoria explained while documenting their shocked responses for potential use in legal proceedings. The intellectual property licensing framework had created a situation where Meridian's termination decision would simultaneously trigger massive financial obligations, while losing access to proprietary innovations that had become essential to their competitive position. Victoria's strategic planning had transformed employment termination into a lose-lose scenario that would damage Meridian regardless of their personnel decisions. Walsh attempted to regain control of the deteriorating situation by suggesting that Victoria's intellectual property claims could be challenged through corporate legal proceedings that might reduce or eliminate both licensing obligations and non-compete compensation requirements. The suggestion revealed dangerous misunderstanding of Victoria's comprehensive legal preparation while creating additional evidence of retaliatory intent. "Jennifer, I welcome thorough legal review of my intellectual property documentation," Victoria replied while withdrawing additional evidence that would support both her ownership claims and wrongful termination litigation. "However, I should mention that challenging my intellectual property rights will activate certain defensive provisions that might impact Meridian's operations." Victoria's defensive legal strategies included patent infringement litigation, trade secret misappropriation claims, and regulatory compliance violations that could be pursued against organizations attempting to use her innovations without proper authorization. The defensive measures would create operational disruptions while generating additional financial damages through legal expenses and competitive disadvantages. The meeting continued for another 30 minutes as Meridian's executives attempted to identify alternatives that might reduce their financial exposure while achieving their discriminatory termination objectives. However, Victoria's comprehensive preparation had anticipated every potential response, while creating strategic positions that would enable her to achieve superior outcomes, regardless of their tactical approaches. Harrison finally acknowledged that Victoria's termination would proceed according to her employment agreement terms, while triggering all associated compensation and intellectual property consequences. The admission represented complete capitulation to Victoria's strategic position, while confirming that their age-based discrimination would create unprecedented financial consequences for corporate shareholders and stakeholders. Victoria, we will process your termination according to the employment agreement provisions while ensuring that all compensation obligations are fulfilled promptly, Harrison stated with the resigned tone of someone recognizing that strategic miscalculation had created unavoidable consequences. Victoria accepted their termination decision with professional grace, while understanding that her systematic preparation had transformed potential career disruption into the foundation for unprecedented professional empowerment and financial independence. The $8 million non-compete compensation would provide immediate capital for expanding her intellectual property businesses while establishing precedents for professional protection that would benefit experienced workers throughout multiple industries. However, the most significant aspect of Victoria's triumph was not immediate financial compensation, but demonstration of how systematic preparation and strategic thinking could enable individual professionals to protect themselves against corporate discrimination, while building independent capabilities that transcended traditional employment relationships. As Victoria gathered her documentation and prepared to leave Conference Room A for the final time as a Meridian employee, she reflected on the 3 years of comprehensive preparation that had made this moment possible. Her colleagues had attempted to discard her as professionally obsolete, while simultaneously depending on her innovations for their competitive success. Their cognitive dissonance had created vulnerabilities that her strategic planning had converted into unprecedented opportunities for professional advancement and industry influence. Victoria Chen walked out of Meridian Pharmaceuticals carrying documentation that would soon establish her as a pioneering example of how experienced professionals could build strategic protection against age-based discrimination, while creating independent business empires that exceeded the scope and influence of traditional corporate employment relationships. Her transformation from vulnerable employee to empowered entrepreneur was just beginning to unfold. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.